listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with the briefing. 2 weeks tomorrow, that's Wednesday, November 6th, our time, Americans will vote to elect Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, the next president of the United States. Polls in the US tell us the race between Trump and Harris might be the closest election we've seen in living memory. But can we trust the polls? Are they more or less reliable now than when they roundly failed to predict Donald Trump's first presidential win in 2016? As we count down to what could be the most consequential US election of our lifetimes, this episode of The Briefing, we present your cheat sheet for US election polls and what you need to look out for in the lead up to Election Day. Galen Druke is host and producer of the FiveThirtyEight Politics podcast and one of a handful of top US journalists that pretty much everyone in the world of US politics turns to when they want to understand the polls. Galen, welcome to The Briefing. A lot of people remember the polling disaster that failed to predict Donald Trump's first win in 2016. Why should we trust what the polls say about this US election?
So interestingly enough, I should actually say that there was a larger polling error in 2020 than there was in 2016. Nationally, in 2016, the polls were off by about 3 percentage points. In 2020, they were off by more like 5 percentage points. To put that in perspective, the average error in a presidential election for the polls going back 25 years is 4 percentage points. So there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that polls are not getting all that less accurate. But the bad news is when elections are as close as they are, it's difficult for polls to tell us precisely who is going to win. And in many ways, that's not exactly what they're designed to do. Polls are used best to get a sense of what the American public or any public really wants. And they still work when it comes to asking about policy questions like what Americans think about abortion or the southern border or gun control or climate change. But actually getting us the exact answer in a super close presidential race is maybe too much to ask of the polls.
That brings in the margin of error. Could you just explain what that is and why it's important in this particular race?
Yeah, so the margin of error refers to sampling error when a pollster goes out and talks to, say, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 Americans. What they're seeking to do is get a random sample of people out there who will ultimately be representative of the voting public. But you're going to get a slightly different sample every time you poll the nation. I mean, that even happens. Think about when you get a blood test. You can get results one day that don't exactly match a blood test that you'd get a month later. That doesn't necessarily mean that your health has fundamentally changed. It just means that the sample you've collected is slightly different. So with the margin of error, that's what we're talking about. We're usually talking about sampling error. That is not the totality of error that can exist in a poll. And we have seen different kinds of error or possible error over the past decade that pollsters are really trying to correct for, right? Pollsters are really invested in this and they iterate from one election to the next, really trying to get it right. But this is difficult stuff ultimately.
Whenever a poll comes out for any election, whether it's in the US or Australia, anyone who wasn't personally polled might reasonably say, well, they didn't ask me. You know, how is it that a poll of 500 or 1,000 people can be representative of a whole state or even a whole country?
Yeah, so great question. I've never heard from the pollster. They didn't contact me. And we do see that there have been declining rates of response to pollsters. These days, something like 1% of the people who are called actually respond to the pollster. As a result, it's almost a blessing or surprising that polls have remained as accurate as they have, despite those declining response rates. But the way that sample collection works is we're applying the scientific method to understanding public opinion. The more people you contact, the more people you have in your sample, the more representative it will be. But there are declining returns. So I would say for a national poll, having 1,000 respondents is really solid. But polling is expensive, right? Because response rates are so low, you have to hire when it comes to a gold standard poll, a human person to be calling and calling and calling and trying to get responses. And once you hit that 1,000 mark, going from 1,000 to 2,000 doesn't get you all that much more in terms of accuracy.
What has been the story of the polls since Kamala Harris took over from Joe Biden up until now?
So when Biden dropped out of the race, he was trailing Trump by about 3 percentage points nationally and doing a bit worse in the battleground states. Of course, as I'm sure folks know, it's the Electoral College that decides who wins the presidency. So the battleground states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona are really what we're talking about here. So Biden was down nationally and in the most important states. And in short order, that turned around to the point where when Harris ultimately accepted the nomination for the Democratic Party, she was leading Trump by something like 3 points nationally and in just about all the battleground states, although marginally. She also had a good performance, according to the polls, in the debate that she had with Donald Trump and continued to see leads across the country. Now we're getting to a point where, looking at Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, the polls are essentially tied. In North Carolina, Trump has about a point lead, and in Georgia and Arizona, he has about a 2-point lead. So if the polls are accurate, this could be the closest election in a century.
So is it reasonable to say that you can't really say which candidate is leading right now in any of those states or at the national level?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a great answer to have to hear, but given what all of the data suggests, anybody who tells you right now that they can tell you who will win the election is kind of messing with you, or at least not speaking empirically. Folks should be prepared for an election result in which the polls are highly accurate and this is super close and we may not even know on election day. They should also be prepared for a result where Trump wins by a clear margin and a result where Harris wins by a clear margin. Because yes, I think to the point that you made earlier on, we have seen the polls underestimate Trump 2 presidential elections in a row. But that doesn't mean they're guaranteed to again. The polls could underestimate Harris like they did Democrats in 2012 and to a lesser degree in 2008. The direction of polling error is unpredictable. Otherwise, pollsters would just go in and correct the polls if they could predict where the error lies.
Whenever a new big poll comes out from the New York Times, Siena, or one of the other well-respected pollsters, and it says Trump is ahead or Kamala Harris is ahead by 1 or 2 points, given what we know about, as we've discussed, the margin of error, how should you interpret that when you're just a regular person hearing that headline?
Put it in the average, right? So you get closest to the end result by averaging the polls together and not putting too much weight on any one poll. And from almost an emotional perspective for election watchers, it's a tough go to have to sort of emotionally follow the roller coaster of polling. One day it seems good for your side, the next day it seems good for the other side. Ultimately, put it in the average and know that trend lines take longer to form than just one day. So from one day to the next, you probably shouldn't be feeling emotional somersaults. But of course, if over a week span or more, you see the polls trending in one direction, I think that's probably real movement.
The polls in the US are very close for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, but in Australia, polls done about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump show a very, very wide margin that Kamala Harris is the favoured candidate for Australians. Why is it that, looking from outside America, you've got a candidate who says things like, I want to be a dictator on day one, who's got all these felony convictions, who seems to be a clear and present threat to the democratic norms? Why is it that it's so close, do you think?
Boy, there's a lot of reasons this election is close. And I think based on listening to what the American public says, as somebody who pays a lot of attention to public opinion research, I mean, the number one issue that folks say they're focused on is the economy. And people retrospectively look at the Trump economy and think fondly of it. So over the past 4 years of the Biden administration. The first 3 of those, prices were growing, and at times growing significantly faster than wages. So in some ways, Americans were growing poorer, and they reacted really negatively to that. I mean, we hadn't seen significant inflation in some decades, and we saw the highest levels since the 1980s. So I think to some extent, people are responding to the economics of it all. In fact, the folks who are most inclined to decide this election, who are undecided or swing voters, are people who sort of feel those economic consequences most intensely and pay the most attention to the economy. You know, we have seen populist movements in pretty much every democracy across the globe. But because of our two-party system, those movements have to get filtered through either the Republican or Democratic Party. And so a lot of what you're just seeing is partisanship. A lot of people are going to vote for the Republican Party, basically no matter who it is. A lot of people are going to vote for the Democratic Party, basically no matter who it is. And so it is those sort of undecided, swing, unaffiliated voters who do put more of an emphasis on some of the issues that I just described, who may well be deciding this election. I'll say, also, they're disproportionately young. So maybe people who aren't super familiar with an era of politics that predates Donald Trump.
If you were to give someone in Australia your cliff notes to watch out for in this election, is there a particular state, a particular group of people? What should we be looking for?
I think there's a sense that American politics are stuck in the mud in some sense and super partisan and super polarized. And some of that is true. But underneath the top line of a very close election, we are seeing some movement amongst subgroups, for example. So some younger voters, and particularly young men, moving to the right. Voters of color also moving to the right. White voters, who have traditionally, a majority of them gone for Republicans, moving to the left a bit. Older voters also moving to the left a bit as well. And so I think it's important to continue to see politics as dynamic and not just static and stuck in the mud. And I should also say that a large percentage of Americans simply do not follow politics the way that, folks who listen to the podcast that I host may follow it, or even listen to this podcast may follow it. A lot of Americans are principally focused on friends, family, jobs, sick loved ones, whatever it may be. And so are not engaged in this hyper-partisan, almost angry, bitter, sometimes mean kind of politics. The majority of Americans find politics distasteful and basically don't want to be involved in it. Unfortunately, these elections are one of the main ways we understand ourselves as a country, as, even nationally, whatever. But in some ways, it forces us into this two-dimensional paradigm that doesn't represent the full sort of color and dynamism of the American people.
On election night, what should people be watching out for? Should they go, whatever happens in Pennsylvania, for example, is probably what's going to be the outcome? Or what would be your advice for what to spot?
I think Pennsylvania is the likeliest tipping point state, but I think most importantly on election night, it's important to hold your roll, because we may not know for some time. If the polls are in fact this close, it may take days, like it did in 2020, until we have a final result.
Well, Galen Druke, this has been so helpful and useful. Thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you.
Galen Druke there. He's the host and producer of the 538 Politics podcast. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this app with anyone you're talking to about the US election. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow from 6 a.m. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.